Welcome to the journey of an aesthete, a comprehensive examination of all things aesthetic, the arts, the humanities, and what it means to be human.
Why do people work? Why does everybody have a career doing some kind of work? People work because they enjoy doing things that are useful. And people work to be able to buy the things they need for themselves and their families. In every single career, people earn that the other people want. Everyone needs food. We all need clothing. We need housing. And we need health care.
Skip, this is Mitch Hampton from Journey of an Aesthete. Welcome to our podcast.
Thanks. Thanks for the coffee.
Yeah, I try to do what I can. For those that don't know, I just completed watching one of Skip's shows, which you do fairly regularly, right? At lunchtime or I think during the day.
Yeah, this is something I started during the beginning of the pandemic last March of last year. And I show old 16 millimeter films from my collection. That's kind of why I collect. And not being able to have live shows, I felt like this is a way for me to show the films from my collection.
Right.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
And
I can't emphasize enough how grateful and thankful I am to you for doing this, because these are some amazing films. Well, anyhow, let me just start from normal introduction. I want to say a few words about what you do. From time to time on this show, we discuss works of art that, for lack of a better word, my category, I would call them utilitarian or functional. So they're not they're not sort of high, complex personal expression, but they're to teach or to serve various institutional, industrial ends. And that's kind of my category for the overarching, types of films that you show that don't fit under the normal, normal fictional or even normal documentary filmmaking. And I don't know that's my term, utilitarian. And one of the reasons I'm having you on this show is you are an expert and a scholar and an archivist of all this material, which is significant and covers, many decades, many styles of films. We'll get to some of that in a bit. And so I guess you've been doing this for a long time. So I think I first met you at Coolidge Corner Theater, right?
Yeah.
And remember when you did shows back? So what period of time would that have been when you were doing sort of road shows at midnight and you would come in and show these 16 millimeter like education films or?
This was like the early 2000s, I feel like.
Okay.
And I was doing some tours where I was going to Boston, New York, Texas, and I was putting together themed shows from my collection of films and showing them. Yeah. Mostly for laughs. I think we did a couple of midnight screenings.
Oh, those were a real treat.
Really, yeah, they were really fun. And I always consider that the gateway drug into having people really think about the importance of these films.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which were, you said, utilitarian. Yeah. Some people call these useful films, ephemeral films, educational. These were meant for a very specific audience in a very specific time. Yeah, and sometimes a specific place. Mm-hmm. And they weren't supposed to last. It's kind of like newspapers. Newspapers really aren't supposed to last past a certain point. And so a lot of these films were destined for landfills and for
The junk heap,
just junk heap because they were considered to be obsolete.
Well, yeah, the junk heap of history, right? So, I'm remembering this wonderful phrase of J.G. Ballard, the writer. He coined the phrase invisible literature. Literature that's not really literature. Maybe it's scientific, but he calls it invisible. It's sort of people don't acknowledge that it's made by somebody, or they don't acknowledge it's
right.
They don't acknowledge its constructed artistic nature. Which, after all, I have to say, I want to get into specific films if you don't mind. But first, I want to talk about your personal biography. But before we get to that, I wanted to say about invisible literature is that it's it often goes under the radar, and it often. But the thing of it is, if you look at a film like Sally at 13 comes to mind, or The Fur Coat Club, which is made by a really great director, Joan Silver, or some of them are good as films, or stuff by The Teaching Company, and, some really, really wonderful work. So it's what I'm saying is there's a lot of stuff that gets, because of the way we categorize things in culture, often gets ignored that shouldn't be ignored. Of course, that's one thing. That's a long-winded way of talking about that. But getting back to you, I'm just curious how you came to be an expert on this material, and how did it start from an interest in film itself, or tell me a little bit about your earliest memories or background that you became the man.
Well, this is the man
for this. Yeah.
This is a hobby that went way out of control. This is like the mid 90s, actually probably early 90s now. Mm-hmm. And I was collecting old audiovisual equipment because I was doing these performances with a bunch of dudes. We were doing lots of noise stuff and experimental stuff. And I always...
So you come,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. So you come out of an experimental avant-garde music tradition. I did not know this. That's interesting.
Avant-garde is in quotes. We just like to make noise and do funny things. And I also, when I was a kid, I really was interested in becoming some sort of video artist. Mm-hmm. But I went to school at a state university, NC State in Raleigh, and they weren't really teaching video art around here. So I was in computer science, and then I was in the School of Design. And that's when I started cutting my teeth on doing video editing and started buying surplus video equipment so I could edit stuff. And at one point I got a 16 millimeter projector and went to this auction where we got 500 films for $50.
Wow.
And these were all educational films, instructional films, dealing with health, dealing with drinking and driving, dealing with drugs, some atomic stuff, driver's ed stuff. It was a phenomenal collection. And at first, they were funny. Yeah. And that's because I was used to seeing them on Mystery Science Theater. Right. And so, and they're corny and funny to kind of look back at. But then at some point I kind of realized, like, you know what, these are actually interesting because they capture kind of a segment in culture.
Absolutely.
Like there was this time where we were afraid of something, and this film is trying to address those fears and try to come up with ways to curb that behavior, or lessen the traffic deaths, or keep people from getting venereal disease, or whatever. There was these films have this kind of, sometimes secret, sometimes not secret agenda.
Yeah.
For trying to
solve a problem,
change our behavior. Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's fascinating. I think that
it's totally fascinating.
Shows us kind of an image of, wow, that's a problem back then.
Yeah.
Wow, that was what our fears were.
Yeah.
Or this is what we were trying to aspire towards at this time, and that's very telling. And sometimes that isn't always shown, especially if you look at like movies of the time, like feature films or TV news of the time. You don't get to see that.
Right.
And these films were really good at showing that.
Well, you're describing sort of the reactions of audiences in the 90s or the 2000s up until now. Of course, these are reactions of people that are too young, not always, but in a large extent, to have been, if the film is really old, to have been around. So there's a certain historical distance and aesthetic distance from these objects. So it must seem in many senses peculiar. So so I guess your journey, your evolution is seeing both the campy aspect of it, or the part that's unintentionally funny, right? That someone might mock, but you're also seeing there's this deeper thing that it's actually part of social history and the history of the United States. As well as I pointed out at the opening, the history of art itself, because I think there's a functional aspect to even the highest art. For example, if you read a great novel by a renowned artistic novelist, that novelist has opinions about things and ideologies or political beliefs, and that comes out in the characters they write in the work. You can't escape it, and that itself is a kind of function. There's a sense in which the novelist is, whether they know it or not, trying to teach something, right? So there's always always a educational element, right? When you say of some kind or to these things.
Right.
But what would you say, so when did the change start to happen? You got these 500 films, but it's amazing that now you have thousands and thousands. So talk a little bit about that journey and your, how you started to.
Well, so what was happening once I got that first batch of 500, some chemistry in my brain changed. And I started realizing wow, these are really fascinating. And I started looking at auctions, and schools were dumping their films, their film libraries. And the reason why is that they replaced one teaching machine with another one. And what I realize now is that over the years, schools and there were all these different ways to try to automatically teach kids something. What is a way, doing it with a human seems so inefficient. Mm-hmm. What if there was a way we could do it automatically? And those teaching machines used to be slides. Mm-hmm. They used to be audio tape or records of, films. And so the teaching machine that was replacing the 60 millimeter was, of course, computers. Computers. We can have computers, and those can automatically teach kids. They can sit down in front of a computer and play games and learn math and all that stuff. And so a lot of schools didn't have the room for a computer lab because they already had all these other, things designated. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, well, nobody's checking out these films anymore. And a lot of these are from the 40s or 50s or 60s. So let's clear those out, and then we'll put in a computer lab. So more often than not, I would show up at a school to pick up a bunch of films, and I would see boxes of computers and desks ready to be moved in. So that's how I ended up with a bunch of stuff. Is I'd go to these auctions and get 1,500 films for $50, or I'd get, people would start just donating to me. Mm-hmm. And that's where we're at now, is that people are like, hey, do you still collect films?
Right.
Do you want mine? I even have old teachers who they rescued the films from the dumpster the first time, but now they realize that, we're just going to, I need to throw them out, or I need room in the garage. So then I get a phone call.
I mean, it's one of the reasons that first attracted me to your shows is you showed so many 70s movies. And you seem to emphasize that, and that's my favorite period for this stuff. I mean, the Coronet stuff in the 50s is interesting, but there's something about that happened in the 70s, early to mid-70s in filmmaking that was just explosive and interesting. You get, as you know, new location shooting and new stylistic things and music, and it seems to be opened up. Whereas in the 50s movies, it's very, these domestic sets. It's a little less, I don't know, it's a little less interesting, but that's a personal. Right. Well, I mean, the 70s is when I grew up. So, of course, I'm interested in that. And I feel like there was a kind of a classic period. 1972 seems to have some of the best movies in my mind. The ones that resonate with me kind of give me this warm feeling in my gut, where I'm like, oh, that kid on that screen is the same age as me. That's right. And these are the types of things I would have seen and felt. So, the 70s are
a precious time for me. But one of the interesting things is that a lot of people like to see my shows because there's a nostalgia, but there's also, I like to kind of flip it on its head, because nostalgia isn't, you remember things like, oh, that was sweet. Or like, no, let me show you how it was. And these films can do that. These films can show you how it was.
Yeah.
And you go like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Or I never knew that.
That's it.
I think the best example of that is, I don't know if you came to the show I did where I showed Telezonia, a film from the 70s on how to use a telephone, and it's made for kids.
Oh yeah.
And it's a musical, and there's people dressed up in costumes, and it basically teaches.
I love that film. But go.
I'm sorry?
I love that film.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. But what it reminded me is like, oh yeah, there was a time I didn't know how to use a telephone and I had to learn how to dial. Yeah. Like, we had dial phones, and that requires a little bit of thinking on how to do that, especially if you're a kid. And like, what's the concept of how to use a phone book, and what's phone etiquette? All these amazing things that kind of teach us about, how to use a phone. And if you watch that film now, you can just go like, wow, things have changed so much since that time.
That's interesting, because that's in response to that film that you can only have now. Right. So that's a sense in which the art object, in the case Telephonia, it changes its meaning over time. The film has to be seen in a different way today, right, than it would have been when people had just one wall-mounted phone in their house. If you're watching, if you're watching Telephonia in 1984, it might have a totally different feeling, even as late as 1984, 85 than 2021, right, or 2020,
right.
And that's an interesting. It's actually really a profound change, and I'm sure you've thought a lot about that.
Yeah, and that's what I like, is the fact that these films still teach us things. And they don't necessarily teach us what was the intended lesson, but they teach us about how things changed over time culturally. Yeah. And, a lot of these educational films people call propaganda. And I would say yes and no. Propaganda in the way that it's trying to get the word out about what is, the standard norms. It's trying to maintain the status quo. Right. Now, chances are the status quo wasn't great. It wasn't good, especially with gender and race issues. Yeah. But it was the status quo of the time. Right. And a lot of people look at that and think like, well, these messages are very conservative. Well, believe it or not, those films were actually very progressive for their time, because they were trying to show kids and show adults like, hey, this is how things are. Yeah. This is what you can do to participate in society. Right. Here are, and some of them are, they don't always age well, but some of them age amazingly well, where you're like, wow, I wish that this film would be shown now. Yeah, you're thinking maybe people could use this film today. What's an example of one title that comes to mind that fits into that? Now that if you had to just think of a title. Well, there's actually really interesting ones about race. That came out in the 40s, post World War II. In fact, there's a lot of interesting films that came out post World War II. Yes, that are trying to say like, hey, we just fought a world war where we took on fascism. Yeah, and this is what you have to be careful of, because fascism can show up even in our country. That's right. And it talks about it very specifically and very explicitly about like, here are issues that we are having, and we need to address them. Otherwise, we're going to go down the same path as Germany. It could happen here, quality. Well, of course, as you know, some of the artists and creators of those films were themselves on the left, or were, of course. Yeah, there were. So that's going to be part of it too. But yeah, that makes sense. Well, some of those films are really wonderful. I'm just wondering any specific titles that are favorites, or that you. Well, the House I Live In, which has Frank Sinatra. Don't Be a Sucker, which was released by the War Department, which is basically saying like, hey, be aware, don't get caught up in this misinformation about that's trying to divide us as a country. And that stuff is just like, wow. Yeah. Man. why wasn't that shown recently?
Exactly.
So, films like that are just like, that's amazing. And also you can see films that get it wrong. And they get it wrong because who's paying for the film? So we have a lot of films which are called sponsored films.
Oh, yeah.
Where they were sponsored by a company or by a lobbyist group, and films that talk about free enterprise and talk about labor and, hint at the idea that labor is, if you're siding with labor, then you could potentially be a communist because communists have infiltrated those organizations. And so there's a lot of these things that were talked about then that still show up. People talk about it now.
Yeah.
And you're like, it's like, well, I know where that phrase came from. Political stuff like that, is fascinating.
It is.
And, I guess the other thing is that I watch a lot of these films and I always, it's hard not to kind of sit and think about like, well, what's the ramifications of this? And one of the things I realize is that everybody should have taken home economics in school. Because home economics teaches you how to cook food.
Absolutely.
It teaches you about nutrition. It teaches you how to budget, how to balance your checkbook, and, how to sew clothes. It's like, wow, I should have, instead of taking, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I was going to say something about.
Well, instead of taking French in high school, I should have taken home ec. I mean, exactly. Because those are the problems that I'm having is, I can't cook very well. I certainly can't sew. Yeah. I didn't know how to budget until just recently. So,
right.
All that stuff is important life skill stuff.
Well, it raises you raise a profound question because you talked about how progressives and, so what I would say is progressive in a neutral sense of that term, not as progressivism as only a point of view, but in the sense of, I guess aspirational, is the idea that anybody can be taught anything. So there was a kind of a very egalitarian component when you say to some of these home ec type movies that you'd have an advisor, scientific advisor from a state university or from Illinois about how to cook something, right? That's right. That also fits into the progressive, I guess, ideal that this is something that can be transmitted. It's not exclusive knowledge, and it's available to everybody, right?
Right. And yeah, I mean that's the idea is that there were actually home economic programs at universities. So they actually, I think the first one was actually at Cornell. And they were like, what, the homemaker, the housewife has a very important role, and her role is to run the family and the household, make sure that the kids are fed, to make sure that, that the family dynamics are working out okay, the kids are being raised okay. This is an important thing, which got a little during Women's Lib, saying that someone was a housewife was like a negative thing. And I think that much later, a lot of the key pioneers in Women's Lib basically said, we were wrong. Being a housewife and being a mother is super important, and I'm sorry that we ever put that down. And it's obvious in these films, like, wow, this is an important job that the homemaker, the woman is doing. And somebody needs to do it for the family, because if it doesn't, then bad things can happen.
Yeah, real bad things can happen. Well, of course, now you're touching on a part of the history of feminism itself and the different schools or styles of feminism, right? Where some people, feminism is starting to be interested, I guess, in housework as a form of labor. With interests.
Right. I mean, it's always been what it is.
Well, it's always but self-consciousness is a form of labor that we can then appeal to the state to try to sort of give added dignity and importance and, a sense of consciousness of that. But what you're saying is that in these films you can see bits of that, right? You can see, I guess. Yeah,
well, it just basically says that, and I think that maybe in the 90s, when I was showing these films, the idea that a woman, her path was she would have like a job until she got married. Then she would raise a family. And it was always, everybody kind of groaned like, oh, that's not great. That's horrible. But then it's like, wait a minute, actually, that's pretty important. I mean, she could get a job and do other things, but the fact that she has decided to dedicate her time to help raise a family is actually pretty great because it's a lot of work.
because then the family will get raised. I mean, somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, exactly. As opposed to, generations of kids not being raised and, all the problems associated with that.
That's beautiful. I mean, I didn't know we could get into that topic so early, but I guess it comes out of these films. But I guess I wanted, so you're starting to, I guess, gather knowledge about this. Right. Matters, but at the same time, you're getting artistic technological knowledge, right? Because you're learning about 16 millimeter and all these films. Did you want to talk a little bit about that dimension, the different companies that made these and the styles of making, or because I don't know, there's just much to say there. I don't know what you were discovering about that during this same.
Well, the interesting thing is that when I started collecting, I thought that, like a lot of people, that these films were government produced because I would see some that were government produced. But the vast majority of them were actually made by companies that did it for money. Okay. Like, they didn't do it because they thought it was, socially important. They did it because they wanted to make a buck. And so you had some educational film companies that were, so Encyclopedia Britannica, Coronet, Centron Films. Then later there was Journal, there was Bailey, there was Phoenix, there was Film Associates. There's hundreds of these companies that would make these films. And so you had big companies that would make it, but then you would also have really interesting thing. You would have these amateur filmmakers who would shoot footage. They would add narration, and then they would sell the film.
That's right.
And so you would have really kind of people who would advertise in the back of these trade journals and say, like, the life of a butterfly. And it's basically somebody who is a hobbyist photographer who shot, footage of butterflies. And then they added some music and narration, and then they sold it.
Yeah. You collect some of those too. You have been, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they show up in collections because I get stuff from schools. So lots of stuff show up in schools. And, of course, eBay. I bought stuff on eBay over a period of time. And so, I run across those as well. And what's interesting is those, because they're not by some big company, they have a more personal touch. Women filmmakers show up a lot in these. And, you get to see kind of more, some of these are just kind of glorified home movies. So you just kind of see like, oh, well, that's the family sitting around the table. And then they decided to edit a film about good table manners or something based on that. So the reason that I really like these films is because they were made all over the country. Yeah. And they capture parts of the country and things in the country that maybe would not be caught for television or not be shown in a feature film or a newsreel.
That's right.
So there is some interesting stuff that shows up, and there's parts of the United States that are captured beautifully in educational film.
Absolutely.
That were not really shown anywhere else.
Well, that's one of the reasons. One of the other reasons I love, under my rubric of utilitarian, is that you see a documentation in some of these films of historical facts about American life, both regional and that itself is infinitely interesting, or ought to be interesting to people. That's important. Did you want to talk about individual films at all? I know that.
Sure. I mean, did you have some that resonated with you when you saw them?
Well, there's
I can certainly
so many, but I can't talk about all of them. But leaving me out of it, certain films sort of became collectively sort of hits, like Shake Hands with Danger. Right. You folks have to put that out, and you guys were behind the Shake Hands with Danger. But what do you think accounts for the enormous success of that particular film? You think how it took off?
It is the song. Yeah. And it is the humor, and the fact that even though it was shot in like the late 70s, 1980, it's still being shown today.
Yep.
and it's shown for the purpose that it was intended, which is to teach people to be careful around heavy equipment. It was made for Caterpillar.
That's right.
The people that make the giant industrial earth-moving equipment. And it was made specifically for people that were working on and repairing that equipment, because those things are super heavy. And if you're not careful, you will get crushed, or you will fall to your death, or something horrible will happen to you. So this film was made as a way to kind of educate people. And the filmmakers, Centron Films, which they were based in Lawrence, Kansas, they, one of the people that worked for them, Jim Stringer, wrote a song, Shake Hands with Danger. And he had a guy named Charles Oldfather who sang it with a nice country twang.
Yeah. And
it's super, super catchy. And
it's a great song. It's a great song.
Yeah, it's
the musician.
Yeah, and they actually they released it on cassette and sold it at Caterpillar tractor places, and they sold like tens of thousands of copies of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the story of that film. But that film is wow. Talk about a. Would you say that's one of the more famous or the more beloved of films in these categories we've been discussing, or it's up?
Oh yeah, by far. And I think the reason why I like showing it is because it's an example of a successful film. Like because we can look at these films in hindsight and say like, yeah, what were they thinking? That was kind of dumb, or wow, isn't that a dated concept? But this is an example of a film that really got it right. Yeah. And you're like, wow. And that's why it's still being shown today. And why, if you look on YouTube, you'll see that some community colleges and technical colleges actually have students make their own version of Shake Hands with Danger, like using whatever is in their shop. And it's really great. And it just tells me that it's just a phenomenal piece of work. And that's what I like to do, is I like to show the fact that the people that made these films, they were trying to really get the word out and try to identify who their audience was and what will resonate with their audience. I mean, if you think about the Ohio's Highway Safety Film Foundation films like Signal 30 and Mechanized Death and Wheels of Tragedy, those films, they try to resonate by just showing gore. They show people who were just in car accidents, and it's horrifying. But it has, I talk to people who are like, do you have those films that they showed, those ones of all the people that are lying dead on the road? And I'm like, I do. And they're like, yeah, that messed me up. Because that was oftentimes the first time somebody ever saw a dead person was in their driver's ed class.
Wow.
But the thing is, that shocked people so much that, sometimes the safety message was left out. Like, people don't identify with it. They look at it and they're like, well, that's not me. Look at how old that car is. I have a new car. Or, teenagers will do whatever they can to kind of convince themselves that they're invincible. And so they won't identify with the message if it's too strong.
That's right.
Drug films are the same way. If you show something that's too intense, then they'll just tune it out.
Everybody needs an anchor in life. You, me, just everybody. Anchor made this whole show possible. I'm immensely grateful to them. You too can use Anchor to make your own shows and create your own vision. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Yeah, like the Sonny Bono, Anita Bryant picture, right? Isn't there a Sonny Bono famous one?
Well, those are two separate ones. So there's the Sonny Bono marijuana one, where he talks about the dangers of marijuana and tries to reason with you and have you kind of come to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
And he's wearing this amazing gold lame suit.
That's one of my favorite things about the film, but go ahead.
Yeah. And he talks about, and there's a couple of films like this where they try to reason with the viewer and say like, hey, we're going to show you some things. It's up to you to decide. And so he says some things, but then there's a lot of teenagers that kind of chime in and talk about, what's going on. And it's not just about marijuana. It's about other things, just how we're dealing with society at the time. This is the late 60s, all this stuff. The Anita Bryant one was made by a TV station in Florida, and
yeah, this an orange juice tie-in or something, or some kid.
Yeah, and so Anita Bryant she narrates. You don't see her, so you don't know if she's wearing something cool like Sonny Bono is, but basically it's these little tiny vignettes that try to explain what drugs are like, and the film's called Drugs Are Like That. Yeah. And it kind of fails. It kind of makes sense, but then it kind of fails in a weird way. Yeah. And you see where they're trying to go with it. So drug films are those ones that kind of sometimes get it right, but a lot of times don't get it right at all, get it really wrong. And especially, if we think about, again, we watch these films back that were made in the 60s and 70s and even 80s. And now we think about, well, those drugs that they're talking about are actually legal in the state. Yeah. Or those drugs, so what is that information? What was all that scare stuff? Was that not real? Or, so it's kind of interesting to watch in hindsight.
Yeah, it brings up to mind another big topic, sex films or health films. Mm-hmm. You show a lot of those. Is there anything about that category? I mean, the non-adult, non-pornographic ones, the right. Educational ones. Is there anything that comes to mind that you want to say about that particular genre?
Well, I should say that there is a topic or a genre called academic porn, which are shown in human sexuality classes where it shows people just having sex, but the music is not as good. So there's a couple of different types of sex ed film. So there's ones that deal with puberty. Yeah. There's ones that deal with, where do babies come from and reproduction. Mm-hmm. Then there's ones that deal with venereal disease or STIs, as they're called now, sexually transmitted infections. Mm-hmm. And so different ones have different techniques, and sometimes you'll find a film that smushes them all together into one thing. It's like, all right, we have the kids, we got them to sign their permission slip, so we're going to just shove all this information in their heads. Yeah.
Almost too.
And so again, some of those are good. You're like, wow, this film was made in the 50s, and this is amazing. Why wasn't this film shown? And then some of them are like, is this about sex? Because I haven't seen, I don't know, there's a bunch of flowers. I don't know what this is about.
Yeah. You mean they're so euphemistic and G-rated, right? That they're trying to.
Yeah, exactly. And so, a lot of these films were, and the whole curriculum of sex education was determined by the school board. And so if you had a school board that was kind of leaning conservative or prudish, you wouldn't get to see anything. Yeah. Or you'd have to, there was a whole thing about signing a pink slip for girls when they were going through menstruation, or getting towards that age, they would basically separate the girls and the boys. Right. The boys maybe would watch something, but the girls would watch a film. Mm-hmm. And it was usually, what's interesting about this is they would watch a film about their bodies and what the changes were in their bodies. Yeah. Most of those films were sponsored by a company that made feminine hygiene products.
That's right. Of course, that would make sense.
So Modus or Tampax or, whoever, they were making the films because basically they were advertising to, the next generation of future customers. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating. And guys didn't get that. So the films made for guys, you don't really see, there's one or two from the 50s, whereas there were a bunch for girls in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And you start to see it for the guys in the 60s, but it's really like, well, we got the girls aside, so maybe we should get the guys aside. Yeah. And then in the 70s and 80s, kids would sometimes be together and they would see these films.
That's right. And they would giggle a lot. And what's interesting?
Oh, yeah. Lots of giggling.
Well, to get really meta about this, in some of my favorite teen high school genre pictures of the 70s and 80s, the fictional characters in those high school films watch some of these films. right? There's always this scene where they watch this thing from the 50s and think it's impossibly outdated and square and make dirty jokes. So there's also that motif, right, of the sex ed.
And so what's interesting about this, and this is what is interesting about these films, just films in general that deal with hygiene, is why does the school have to show these? Why did the school feel like it was compelled to pull kids aside and show them these films?
And what did you find?
And it's because some parents were not teaching their kids these lessons.
Yeah. Wow.
And it's like, this kid stinks, and we need to do something to make sure that this kid kind of knows, maybe not that kid himself knows that he stinks, but he knows that kids stink. And so taking a bath like once a week is important. And so, that's a social thing. That's what I call social engineering. It's the idea is like you're helping this kid realize that I need to be clean because otherwise people will judge me harshly. Mm-hmm. And it's maybe not a message that the parents instilled to them.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that some of these films reflect problems inside the family structure or class issues or economic inequality or poverty, that these are things that come to the fore. And you're saying that schools are having to deal with the effects of all that? Is that kind of in a roundabout? Is that
right? And that's one of the things is, schools are charged with having to, one, keep kids for a certain period of time, right, so that their parents can work and that they're not running wild in the streets. Right. But the other part of it is like they're charged with we need to make productive members of society. And so what can we do to help that happen? Like, what are the factors that help kids blend in with society and so that they're not sticking out? Because outcasts in society are bad news. Yeah. They become criminals, they become, whatever, drug dealers or druggies, or, they get pregnant too early, or any of these social ills. Yeah. So what can we do to kind of make that happen? And so there's lots of films that talk about how to be a friend. That's right. And, how, about the social aspects of life. Yeah. Living. And so it's fascinating that schools did that, but it's also, again, we're going back to this idea that it's fairly progressive. Yeah. Instead of just letting the kid fail on their own and not really help them. Well, here's a film that kind of shows what can be done. Yeah. And this is, pointing out with a third person, this is what, such and such is, talks too much and is blah, blah, blah. And so people don't like them. It's like, oh, well, hopefully you show that to a kid and they go, oh, is that me? Okay, well, I'll modify my behavior. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, watching those films that you just described now in a cultural context like ours, where I hold that thought. I was going to say that now we're in a context where there's a maximum amount of freedom or desired freedom for social groups, right, and for interests. Mm-hmm. And probably some of those things in even post-war films that were thought of as progressive probably would be seen as reactionary or conservative now, because the idea now is that you ought not to teach anything, right? Because if you teach something, you're imposing, right? You're imposing a mainstream identity or a mainstream way of life on this genuine subcultural identity or niche. So I'd imagine that are some of the films you show more controversial now for that reason than they would have been when you showed them, or more there's more distance from the film among audiences, or just a question that popped into my mind. Well, it seems like that, some films, like I said, don't age well. They're just like, ooh, that doesn't feel right. Yeah. And again, it was about maintaining status quo back then. Right. And so our view,
they're bound to the time in which they were created.
Exactly. And so you've got to kind of put yourself in that brain space. And that's one of my challenges that I just don't show the film, is I try to contextualize a little bit and give you a sense of here's some things to look for. And this is when this film is made, and maybe explore, why was this film made?
Oh, wow.
Because there's some films that I get where I'm just like, I don't know what the point of this film was. Like, why did they show this? Who did they show this to? And I think a good example of that is a film that is, so when I've done like call-in radio shows when I've gone on tour.
Okay.
And twice in different parts of the country, somebody would call in and say, I saw this film when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
It features a kid getting off a school bus, falling into the snow and dying.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, oh yeah, that's Cypher in the Snow.
Yeah.
And they're like, why did they show that film to me? And so, have you seen this?
It's been so long that I barely remembering it. It's been a while, but go ahead. It's important.
Right. Well, the premise of this is, and this is made by Brigham Young University.
Oh, it's a Mormon film. Okay.
And the point of this film is that this kid dies because nobody loves him. Basically, you find out that he's from a broken family. He gets picked on in school. The teachers kind of just don't pay attention to him. And basically, he just stops living because nobody loves him. And this film was shown to third graders. This was shown to lots of kids. And my take on this is, oh my God, that film should not have been shown to a single kid because in that scenario, there's nothing that the kid could do to get out of that.
Yeah.
Like the kid is not given any opportunity to break out of this cycle of depression. And it basically just says nobody loves you. And if nobody loves you, there's studies that show that kids die, babies die if they don't get any attention. And so imagine if you're a little kid in the third grade and you had an argument with your parents and you feel like they don't love you. Then you watch this film that says basically, if your parents don't love you and you're not doing well in school, you could die. That film is horrible.
Yeah,
and I realize the film is not made for kids. It's made for parents. It's made for adults. It's made for teachers.
Yeah. And
it's talking about the importance of cultivating a child, like how you pay attention to a child and they will respond, etc. And it has traumatized an entire generation of kids.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, I didn't see that film as a child. I saw it as an adult. I think maybe from one of your shows, possibly, or in some other venue, which is different. So there's films you see and films you don't. I wanted to ask about individual films, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Sally at 13 is a personal favorite. I think it's a beautiful film. Did you ever meet the filmmakers of that or know who?
I did not. I tried to do a little bit of research to see what the deal was, because this is a film that feels like it was actually part of a bigger film.
Oh, I see.
Like it's basically a young girl and her friend kind of, going through puberty, and it doesn't deal as much with the educational aspect of it, but the emotional aspect of it. And just trying to fit in and trying to, be older than she is, and just dealing with the hassles of being a girl in a middle school situation. Yeah. And I think it's really great. It's a wonderful portrayal of what's going on. But it just kind of abruptly ends.
Well, so you think there's a scene missing, or you think it's a part? I never hadn't occurred to me that.
No, I think that like the film itself, I check to see is something been clipped out? Like no, it just ends. Okay. And I think that this might have been a project, a coming of age film that somebody did that they just didn't finish. And so I have seen films like that have been released where it's like, that kind of doesn't look done. There's aspects of it. It gets the point across, but it kind of doesn't, it's very jerky or doesn't feel right. And then, so I haven't been able to find the information about the filmmaker or about the film in general, but it is this really wonderful film about, being a young girl going through puberty.
Yeah, well, speaking of I have here in front of me the best of Remember when you released that in the pre-internet?
Oh yeah, yeah.
I still have some of your pre-internet DVDs. They're fantastic here. And on the best of there's one film that stands out, and I'm going to be on record saying that this might be the weirdest movie I've ever seen. Anyway.
Oh, excellent.
And it's so weird you can barely pronounce the title. I think you know the film I'm talking about. It's a movie, and I'm just dying to know if
is it Malika Palika 2 Skip 2?
It is Malika Palika Skip 2, and I'm dying to know how much you know about this. That I know, or if other people agree with me that this takes the cake as one of the odder films of the 70s.
Yes, it is very strange. And it was made by this company called Crocus Productions, who did other films. They did other films involving stop motion, either with clay or with other things, mostly with clay. Uh-huh. And so they did a film called Munchers, which was a dental hygiene film. They did one called, it's a bus safety film, and I can't remember the name. It's another weird made-up thing. Anyways, Malika Palika Do Skip 2 is really strange. And it's a film that's about creativity and imagination, but it goes way off the rails. You basically have these two kids who they're like clay kids, and they enter this land called Malika Palika Do Skip 2, and they turn themselves into beanbags.
Yeah.
Now, why they turn themselves into beanbags, I mean, from a technical standpoint, maybe it's easier to animate a beanbag, yeah. But I just, it's baffling to me. And I tried to reach out to some people in Chicago, because they were Chicago-based, to see, like, what the deal is, to see if they knew anybody, any names percolated, because sometimes those show up. And then oftentimes when I put stuff on the internet, like Internet Archive or YouTube, sometimes a filmmaker will find me and say, like, hey, you got my film. And they're excited that somebody's put it online. Some of them I get, they're like, yeah, you got to take that down. But some of them are like, hey, I'm so happy you showed this. It's giving a new life to this film that I worked on. And so I get to ask them a bunch of questions. But the Crocus Production people, I have not found them yet. So I'm just hoping that one day maybe somebody will be listening to this podcast and say,
please,
I know Crocus Productions. Yeah.
Crocus Productions, Malika Badu, Skip 2.
Malika Palika Do Skip 2. Yeah. I only know how to pronounce it because I've shown that film every opportunity I can get.
I can see why. What are some of the more unusual responses you've gotten to it? I mean, people, I don't know, just it's memorable that somebody just freaks out and they don't,
Well, the thing is, like, I introduced the film by saying that this film is not about drugs, but it is certainly influenced by drugs. Because there are lots of weird things in there where you're just like, what? And it's like, is that a hidden drug reference? Or I don't know what's going on. But yeah, people are really baffled by it. Some people hate it. They absolutely cannot stand the film. I feel like my wife doesn't like it. Because it is just so over the top weird. It's so just strange that whatever educational message or entertainment has just been zapped out of it.
Yeah.
And, and I get that, but I love showing it because the reactions are so strong, either for it or so strong against it.
Right.
And ultimately, that's why I like showing the films too, is I love showing films that were made for kids and showing them for adults.
Yeah.
Because kids are so much more open to whatever, and adults have this very set, like, linear sense of how things are supposed to be portrayed. Mm-hmm. So if I show a film that doesn't have an ending, that has an open ending, adults get mad. They're like, how dare you? So
they want to know how it turns out. Is that it? It's like, there's good.
Right. It's like, how dare you, provide this information and then leave it up to me to finish it. And, what's the educational value of that? So you mentioned Fur Coat Club.
Mm-hmm.
Fur Coat Club is another film that polarizes audiences. Most people love the film. Some people don't like it because they're like, what is the point of that film? Is this a film to teach girls to be fur fetishists? What is the deal? Mm-hmm. And they don't like that. They don't like the sense that I'm showing what quote unquote educational film that doesn't seem to have educational value and might even be something that's like teaching bad behavior. And what they don't realize is that some of these films are meant to be shown in what we call language arts or reading. And so the idea is that you show this, then at the end, you have the kids comment on the film, comment on the story. They write their own story. They write their own, they come up with, this is a way to watch something and then think about it critically, like a fourth grade brain thinking critically about something. And so the teacher gets the kids. And so it's intentionally provocative so that kids will respond to it. And think about it. And so this is a way to kind of introduce them to, then you have them start reading literature and stories that are interesting and provocative, and you get them interested in the, in these things and wrapping their heads around these different things. And adults don't necessarily like that. One of my favorite films is this film called Pamela Wong's Birthday for Grandma.
That's a great film.
And it ends with a kind of a tragedy, not a big tragedy. Nobody gets killed or anything, but it ends, and then the film credit runs.
That's right.
And you can hear people audibly go, oh, like upset, like it didn't get ended. Like, we don't know what happened.
Yeah.
And so this is then when, as a teacher, I would say, all right, well, what do you think happened? What, and then, it gets the kids to think and to exercise their brains. And so that's the point of a lot of these films that I love collecting and showing.
I wanted to ask you about an informational question. I mean, well, first of all, what comes to mind when you think about a filmmaker contacting you that was sort of anonymous and a film that you liked, that you showed and you connected with the filmmaker? Any names that you want to offer, the examples of people that you have contacted?
Well, different filmmakers have reached out to me over different periods of time, or also people who have appeared in the film.
Okay.
And so, I ask questions and I try to make sure that they have a decent copy of the film if they don't have it, because some filmmakers don't. Yeah. And I'm like, hey, do you want this? And so, and I try to ask like behind the scenes questions, because some films I have major questions of what was going on behind this film.
Oh, yeah.
And so, that's really great because it kind of connects me with these people. And a lot of these people, they went to film school maybe, and they wanted to make a film, but they couldn't get a job making feature films. So they kind of worked for a regional film company doing commercials or industrial films or whatever. And so there's lots of examples of those. Like, most major cities had a film production company that was making stuff like commercials or industrials or, whatever, promotional films. And so, I love hearing those stories and finding out all this pretty, interesting stuff.
I bet. I mean, it must be exciting to meet somebody that did that and have them make that connection. You're discussing medias. I'm thinking, of course, the famous George Romero film that just was re-released, that he made, the Pittsburgh city of Pittsburgh, which has a political. Do you know what I'm talking about? That would fit under the.
Is this the one about the amusement park, or is this another one?
Yes, it is the amusement park.
Yeah, I have not seen that one, but I have seen other things that he did, I think post Night of the Living Dead, that were sports related. He was, it was all about these different sports stars, like Pittsburgh professional sports stars. And so I've seen some of that. But you kind of, filmmakers, they have to pay the bills. They can't make a film and then just expect to like coast the rest of their lives. They are always, that's what I realize, is they're always hustling, always working on the next project. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of these films, I actually have original materials from some filmmakers that I've been trying to find.
Oh, wow.
And say like, hey, I have this film. It ended up at this place and now I have it and maybe you want it back. And so I try to repatriate whenever I can. But yeah, what happens is people make a film, they put all their energy into it, it's done, then they move on to the next film. And so, that all the material might end up in a storage space or in a garage or in a basement somewhere. And, then they're always thinking about the next project. And so, and some filmmakers, I reach out to them and say like, hey, you made this film. And they're like, did I? I'm like, yeah, your name's in the credits. And they're like, oh, yeah, I just barely remember that. Because, that's constantly working.
Well, that could be a good thing if they were getting a lot of gigs as a filmmaker, that they don't remember something. That the positive part of that was that they were working filmmakers.
Right.
That's good.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to ask you about the moon and NASA, because you made a point in a couple of these news shows. I don't remember you to emphatically say that the moon landing happened. It so happens I'm reading Edgar Mitchell's memoir, The Explorer. Mm-hmm. Do you know this book he wrote in the mid-90s? I don't. It's really beautiful. It's a really good book, but it so happens that I'm just reading that right at the moment that you mentioned that. I thought, that's. Do you know what's the precipitating event or reason that you had to state that, that this is not opinion, this is an event? Have you been getting?
Well, it's been sticking in my craw for a while, that people talk about the moon landing as a hoax.
Oh God!
And part of the reason why is because I actually did work digitizing stuff for NASA, and the plan, I was going to digitize everything that NASA had. But that did not work out because the funding did not happen. I was basically going to take 5 years of my life and just travel and digitize.
I would love to do a whole episode just on your work on that material. I bet that's some amazing material.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
I mean, it's fascinating. Yeah. So what I ended up doing was about 600 videos that I got from the John Glenn Space Center.
Oh, wow.
That were all educational, but some raw stuff in there. But I got to see like a bunch of other things. And I think what's interesting, and I feel this is the case in general. Like I've one of the ways that I make money is selling stock footage.
Oh, wow.
And so I've gotten hypercritical when I watch documentaries and how they use stock footage and what they are concentrating on. And what has happened is these major historical events or these people of history get reduced down to a simple soundbite or to a simple scene. And so when we talk about, it's Martin Luther King's birthday, they always show that I Have a Dream speech. Not even the whole speech, just a segment. And it's like, wow, there's a whole vast amount of other things that you did, and you can talk about and you can show. But when they talk about the moon landing, they always show the same little snippets.
That's right.
And so people are looking at that material and they get hypercritical of like trying to pick out technical issues and saying like, well, that can't be true because look at that flag is waving and there's no error. So how could that happen?
Yeah. Not
thinking about the vast amount of information that was recorded and the photos that were taken and everything that led up to that mission. So it's not like, they flicked a switch and like, oh, we're on the moon. It's like, no, there was years of stuff that was done to end up on the moon. And so when someone says, well, I watched a video and it was very compelling for me to believe that it was a hoax. I'm like, yeah, but did you watch the hundreds of hours of NASA material that was done prior to that? There's so much information, but people, they kind of encapsulate it down to this little tiny thing. And then they get hypercritical of that tiny thing. And it's like, wait, you're missing the giant iceberg of stuff that's under the water, all this stuff. And that's one of my missions is I was like, I want to give access to all those materials because it's phenomenal.
It is. I mean,
And so
that could be its own episode, ideally with
right.
someone from NASA or.
Right.
This book is really incredible. This Edgar Mitchell book. I don't want to get too far off topic, but it's a good one. But so that's just basically your experience working, I guess, with NASA and only increasing your frustration, I guess, at the ignorance of some people, right?
Well, and also somebody. So when I do the streaming shows, people are commenting, and I can read the comments.
Yeah.
And somebody was like, I showed some NASA thing. It wasn't even about moon landing. It was about something else. Somebody's like, well, I don't believe we landed on the moon.
Oh,
I'm like, hold up. And so I had to say something. I was like, all right, you can have your opinions about lots of things, but that's not something you can have an opinion about. It's a factual thing.
Yeah.
And,
Wow. Is there anything else as we move towards conclusion of this wonderful episode that you want to say about preservation in general or about your journey with this material? Anything that comes to mind that you think is important or that you want to emphasize?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. And I say this to a lot of people who are looking to become archivists. One is film is easy to preserve. Video is hard. Video is really hard. But the important thing is preservation is really giving access to the material. And so the challenge for me, once I rescued these from dumpsters or auctions, landfills, whatever, the challenge is to give access to them, put eyeballs on it again. And so that's why I do these shows. That's why I do these podcasts, is to kind of say like, hey, there's this cultural history that's sitting on a shelf and you should check it out and kind of see like, oh, you know what? It's from the past. It's from like 40 years ago, 50 years ago. But guess what? It actually addresses what's going on right now.
That's right.
Or addresses something that could potentially go on in your life.
Mm-hmm.
I've learned so much from these films and give them a shot.
Yeah. That's beautifully put. I want to thank you, Skip. This is, for anybody, this is Skip Elsheimer, AV Geeks. Anything coming up in the future that you want to tell people about that you're doing, projects before we go? Or?
I'm just showing films.
Okay.
We're coming up on probably our 2000th film in a couple of months.
Wow.
That we've shown since mid-March of last year. And so these shows are free and they're on YouTube and Facebook and Twitch. And it's a wonderful way to share stuff. And, if you're hunkered down in your house, the shows are archived and you can watch them at any time. And, join in the fun.
Well, thank you, Skip. I really enjoyed this episode, and be safe and be well and continue doing what you're doing.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I very much appreciate it.
I don't like goodbyes, so I'll see you soon, folks. Thank you.